Hello.
Hello.
Is that an English accent?
It is indeed an English accent. Well detected.
Oh my goodness me. Are you from London?
No, well, I'm actually from the north of England originally, although I've lost my accent, sadly.
Okay. Now, what's your name?
My name's Katherine Carter.
Katherine Carter. So, Katherine Carter, we don't know each other, right?
No.
Clearly. So tell me a little bit about yourself, Katherine Carter. First of all, where are you?
So I am in the southeast. You did detect where my current accent is from. So I am in Surrey, so just outside London. And I've just got home from a day of work at a place you might know called Chartwell.
Chartwell. Yes. Chartwell. That rings a bell.
So it is the former home of Sir Winston Churchill.
Oh my goodness me. The former home of Winston Churchill.
That's
born
absolutely
in
right.
1874.
Well done. Yes, bang on.
Wow, that is amazing. So you work at Chartwell, Winston's first home?
I am the curator at Chartwell, yes.
Oh, that is unbelievable. Wow.
So, but you clearly know your stuff, though. If you're straight in there with his date of birth, I take it you're a Churchill fan?
I am definitely a Churchill fan. 1874 to 1965. I know quite a lot about the great man, but clearly not as much as you do. So tell me about kind of what you do at Chartwell. I mean, I feel like we're in I'm about to have a history lesson.
So, well, at the moment, we are hopefully coming out of COVID here in the UK. We were able to open the doors of Churchill's home and his painting studio for the first time a couple of days ago. We've been in lockdown a lot of the year, as your viewers might know. But in normal times, we welcome about 250,000 people every year to Winston Churchill's home. And it's his country home. So it's a beautiful big house set in acres of countryside and rolling landscape and beautiful gardens. So it's a very idyllic spot.
Wow. Tell me, do you feel his presence at Chartwell?
Do you know what? It's really interesting being in there because the way it was curated, which was largely done by Churchill's widow and his daughter after he died. So essentially, they turned the clock back to how the house was in the 1930s. And the way they've placed everything is so conscious and it's so curated, in fact, that it is intended to feel like the family have just popped out to the garden for a moment. So there's his cigars, there's the very weak whiskey soda by his paint palette in the studio. So it's meant to have that feeling of they could come back at any moment. And so many of my visitors say that they can sort of sense him still.
Really? Wow. That's, you know, I mean, I grew up in London. So my grandfather actually fought in the Second World War. He fought in El Alamein. And obviously being English, we were taught about Churchill, about the Second World War. And for me, a lot of my ethos in life has come from a lot of what this man did, like his quotes, never, never, never give up. And then my favorite one is actually, when you find yourself walking through hell, keep walking. And I remember that all the time when things don't go well, because I'm like, you have to keep on going, because at the end of this hellish moment, you will get through it. And if you don't get through it, if you don't walk through it, it'll keep on coming. So I don't know, what inspired you to want to do what you do?
Gosh, well, I am a very long-standing history geek. I spent most of my upbringing watching history documentaries with my dad and always thought it's so important to understand history. If you don't understand history, you're doomed to make the mistakes of the past again. And I think that in understanding history and where we're from, we can have more of an understanding of where we're going. So for me, it's really important that people are familiar with history in some sense, that people pick and choose what it is that excites them about the past and, you know, be inspired by it, whether it's Winston Churchill or any historic figure. And I think for me as well, getting to work in his home where the history was actually made is so fascinating. It's not a sort of a museum or a space that has been artificially created. It's literally the place where the history happened. And I think that makes me incredibly lucky as a historian to get to do what I do.
I have, that was a beautiful way of putting it. I have many passions, and one of them is history. At school, I pretty much failed everything except history, because history was the only thing that I listened to, because it's so interesting, like you say, to look at the past, because when you look at the past, you learn about why we do what we do. And most people, for some reason, don't look at the past, and then things just keep on getting repeated. So I have a quick question for you. When it comes to Chartwell, you mentioned history. What is one of the greatest moments of history that happened at Chartwell?
So for me, it's a quite a broad period of time. I would say his wilderness years, where he is out of political influence. A lot of people think he is a spent force in politics, but he is being made increasingly aware of Nazi Germany's preparations for war. And so much of the establishment and his colleagues in Westminster were essentially deaf to the fact that this was going on. They were so traumatized, still having the First World War in recent memory, that no one could bring themselves to think that it might happen again. And it was those years at Chartwell in the 1930s where people were bringing him information about German rearmament, about its campaign in terms of building up its aviation and the Luftwaffe. And it was that information brought to him there, even though he was this lone voice saying, we need to be preparing for war, and everyone wouldn't listen. But it was because he was that figure of authority, because of events that happened at Chartwell, that he was the man when the hour came in 1940. So had it not been for events at Chartwell before the war that prepared him for that moment, he might not have been made Prime Minister in 1940.
So even if, I guess the lesson is there, even if you're not kind of maybe living your purpose in the moment, your time will come if you keep on plodding along, right? Which is what Winston was doing. He may not have been in the public eye at that point, but he was laying the groundwork, the foundation within himself, really, to step up in 1940 to become the Winston Churchill that we all know.
Absolutely. And it's that sense of having courage in your convictions as well. If you think that something is wrong, then having the strength to stand up against the common consensus of the time. I mean, there were plenty of people, good people in British society, who felt that Nazism was because it was counter to communism and there was a great fear of communism. They saw Nazism as potentially a good thing, which is shocking to think about now. But if you think about Edward VIII, the king who abdicated, he was quite friendly with Hitler at points. There's, photographs of them shaking hands and laughing together. And so many people couldn't foresee what was coming, but Winston Churchill could. And that was in part because of his understanding of the past. He's a historian, so he has spent his life writing about conflicts of the past, and he can see the patterns that are forming in terms of increasing aggression in foreign policy. But you can take that very specific lesson and apply it to, if you really believe strongly in something, fight for it, and don't let other people disagreeing with you stop you from being on that path. Goosebumps.
So you talk about the past. I was watching a documentary a while back of George Washington, and I don't remember the exact battle, but it was at the beginning of the fight for independence, and some soldier, English soldier, had him in his sights, and for whatever reason he didn't fire, right? And had he fired, the history of the US would have been different. And it's the same thing that happened with Churchill. There were so many times where he could have died, right? I remember in the Boer War, right? He was being shot at. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if this is true, in 1916, didn't he go over the top in the trenches?
He went on numerous forays into no man's land. He did a lot of night reconnaissance work in the First World War. But yes, he was genuinely there in the trenches. A lot of his time spent campaigning for better conditions for his men. So that's something as well, that he's incredibly brave, and he demonstrates that in the First World War, but he also is very mindful of the well-being of those around him as well. So you get both sides of the coin there.
Yeah, and don't you think that in some way, I mean, I'm not sure I believe in destiny, right? But in some way, cometh the man, cometh the hour. I don't know if that's the right quote, right? I always tell people that Winston Churchill basically kept the British together during the Second World War. And in so many ways, he is the only man in that moment that could have done that. Do you think that's true?
I think that in that moment, certainly, there were so many individuals who had been pro-appeasement, so pro-essentially forming some sort of deal with Nazi Germany, that they would have had very little authority to lead from 1940 onwards. So I think that in that sense, who were the senior political figures at that point who could have taken on that role, there wouldn't have been many. But you've also got the fact that Churchill is a very charismatic leader, and he brings people with him. And that is seen, yes, amongst the British public, but also crucially in the cabinet at the time. It was a coalition cabinet, so you've got representatives of all parties. And that isn't something that can run like a well-oiled machine, parties who've been at odds in their entire existence, unless you have someone very strong in the leadership. So yes, I would say that pertains to the actual sort of running of the war itself, but also the wider morale of the British public and the Commonwealth beyond.
What is the greatest thing that you have learnt from your time studying Winston Churchill, from the perspective of your life today? Like, what is the greatest lesson that you learnt? Like, mine is, if I'm going to just distill it into one sentence, it's never, never, never give up. End. Right? What do you think your greatest lesson is?
I mean, that's a very good one. I think you picked a very, very strong one there, and that's definitely a good one for us all to live by. I think, I mean, maybe it's just because I'm an old romantic, but I really love the relationship between Winston Churchill and his wife, and how crucial she was, not only as a support, but as a champion of his. But also what's wonderful is he recognised that. There's a quote of his that says, my greatest achievement was my ability to persuade my wife to marry me. And if you think about that, of everything Winston Churchill achieves, it's persuading Clementine to marry him that he is most proud of. And I think there is something where no matter what we achieve in life, we should, be so grateful for those around us in our lives who love us and support us. And that's something that Winston Churchill was always aware of. So I think we should all be grateful for those around us who look out for us. So I'm just going to say, have you been to Chartwell?
Do you know what? I've never been to Chartwell. I've been to the war rooms, opposite Buckingham Palace. But I've never been to Chartwell, and I've never been remind me the name of his other house, the famous one, where he was born, Blenheim Castle?
Blenheim Palace.
Blenheim Palace, yeah. So I haven't, but I definitely like to go one day.
When you do, I think one thing you'll be struck by is Chartwell is not a huge stately home. It's not got sort of, Grecian columns around the outside or anything like that. It's a mansion, it's a big house, but actually one of the things that's lovely is it's quite domestic in scale. It doesn't have a ballroom. It doesn't have long galleries filled with paintings. You feel like you're going into a home. And for me, that says a lot about Winston Churchill, that's the environment he chose to surround himself in. Yes, a big house, but one thing that you should be aware of actually is the reason he bought it was the views, far more so than the building itself, because it has these incredible rolling panoramic views for miles. And if you think about Churchill, by that point, he'd been painting for 10 years. Painting was something that he really needed as not just as a hobby, but for that sort of headspace and that escape. And he just saw that landscape and thought, nothing can compare to this. So that's what you need to look out for when you come to Chartwell.
I will definitely make a thing to do when I next come to England. Tell me, are those paintings his behind you?
So they are replicas, I should say.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. And another really bizarre question that I'm just curious about. Are there any cigars left that used to be owned by him?
There are. So we have several. So as you go around the house, there's various ashtrays placed with his cigars in.
With his real cigars?
His real cigars, absolutely, yes.
Wow. So I know quite a lot about Winston Churchill. You know quite a lot more than I do about Winston Churchill. However, for those people who are listening or watching who know nothing or very little about Winston Churchill, like in like a minute or two, can you give us his like life arc from 1874 to 1965? No pressure. You want
to elevate a picture of Winston Churchill? Okay.
Yes.
So born in 1874, son of a lord, but his relationship with his father was really terrible, actually. His father used to reference him as a wastrel who had achieved nothing. And Churchill spent his whole life trying to overcome that sense. And so he does so initially by joining the army, and then he fights as a soldier of empire, essentially in the late Victorian era. He also starts writing. Writing is always his main source of income, but his father was a politician, and so that's the path he wanted to follow. And his political career spans from Queen Victoria being on the throne to the Cold War. So you've got to imagine that is arguably the most expansive period of change in British history, and he has a front row seat for the entirety of it. He starts as a Conservative. He crosses the floor to the Liberals for 20 years and crosses back. So he always goes where his heart tells him. And he doesn't always follow the party whip. He's a very independent politician, always does what he thinks is right. He fought in the First World War, as we've said. He held most of the senior offices in British politics and was Prime Minister twice. Firstly, during the Second World War of a coalition government, and then latterly in the 1950s as well. And when he died, his place in history was deemed so important that he was given a state funeral, which very few people in history have ever had. And that goes to show the impact that he had on British history.
Yes, you're a very, very well-spoken historian. But I guess you can't be a historian and not be well-spoken, right? I want to leave you with one final thing. So I had a Boston Terrier a while back. And what do you think his name was?
I don't know. Tell me.
Have a guess.
I mean, after this conversation, I'm tempted to say Winston.
Winston Churchill.
Oh, how super! There you go.
Yeah.
What good name? Was he a loyal friend? I take it.
He was a very loyal, wise friend, and. You know, it's also beautiful to have a conversation with someone that truly understands history, understands the people that make history, understands things that many of us just don't even comprehend, right? Because we're too busy on our phones. We're too busy in our own issues. Yet, I'm not saying you don't have issues. I'm not saying you don't have a phone, right? But what I am saying is that you have seemingly have this capacity to understand things from a perspective of the past, which enables us to fully understand, not that you can really fully understand something, but to understand the present, right? And it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. And I love this concept whereby I have no idea. Look, now I've known you for half an hour, but prior to this, I have no idea who you are. And that's why this conversation kind of is what it is. It kind of, who knows? I've no notes. You have no notes, I assume. I assume you kind of knew who I was because you had to say yes to the podcast. But did they tell you that I liked Winston Churchill?
No, they did not tell me that. I thought that might be why I was invited, but no, they didn't tell me that.
Okay, cool. Well, look, just know, next time I come to London, I will make a trip to Chartwell. I will let you know before, and I very much look forward to it. And thank you so much for taking the time. You really made my day, and it was a beautiful thing.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No worries. Thanks so much.
Hello everyone, it's Leon here, aka The Kindness Guy. If you like my videos, which I hope you do, don't forget to press the subscribe button and also to ring the little bell so that the notifications notify you that I have a new video out in the world.